King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War, which raged from 1675 to 1678, was a monumental conflict that reshaped the landscape of New England. This war was not merely a battle between two groups, but a clash of fundamentally different worlds. An indigenous society struggling to retain its way of life, and a colonial power determined to expand its dominion over the continent. At its heart was Metacom, also known as King Philip, the chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy, and his fierce determination to resist the encroachment of the English settlers on his people's ancestral lands. Metacom was the son of Massasoit, a revered leader of the Wampanoag who had initially forged a crucial alliance with the English colonists. In March 1621, Massasoit and John Carver, the first governor of Plymouth Colony, signed the Pilgrim Wampanoag Peace Treaty. This treaty was a symbol of mutual respect and cooperation, promising aid and defense to each other against common enemies. For over 40 years, this agreement helped maintain a fragile peace between the English settlers and the Wampanoag. However, the arrival of new colonists and the expansion of English settlements began to strain this tenuous relationship. The initial success of the Plymouth colony spurred further English colonization. By 1630, John Winthrop and his fellow Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay with a new wave of settlers. This marked the beginning of a broader colonial expansion. Massachusetts Bay Colony, established by these settlers, soon began acquiring more land from the Native Americans and encouraging further settlement by religious exiles and dissenters. This relentless expansion pushed the boundaries of English settlements further into Native American territories, causing increasing friction. Massasoit's death in 1661 brought his son, Wamsuta, to prominence. Wamsuta, like his father, had an English name, Alexander Pecanicut, and had maintained amicable relations with the colonists. However, in 1662, Wamsuta was summoned by Josiah Winslow, the assistant governor of Plymouth Colony, under the pretext of addressing charges related to land deals. After returning to his village, Wamsuta fell ill and died under suspicious circumstances. Metacom, who succeeded his brother as chief, alleged that Wamsuta had been poisoned. This claim, given Winslow's known hostility towards the Native Americans, was plausible and indicated a deeper malaise in colonial Native relations. Metacom, now the leader of the Wampanoag, found himself in a precarious position. He inherited a land increasingly encroached upon by English settlers and a series of broken promises. The colonial government's disregard for treaties and its relentless expansion led Metacom to conclude that negotiations were futile. Determined to protect his people and their land, he launched a coordinated resistance against the colonists, which would come to be known as King Philip's War. The war began in earnest in 1675, with Metacom leading a coalition of Native American tribes, including the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett. The conflict was marked by a series of brutal and devastating attacks on colonial settlements. The native forces employed guerrilla tactics, launching surprise raids and ambushes. These tactics were effective in the early stages of the war, causing significant casualties and disrupting colonial life. The English settlers, however, were resilient and soon began to mount a counteroffensive. One of the most significant battles of the war was the attack on the town of Lancaster in February 1676. This raid, orchestrated by Weetamoo and Quinnipian alongside Metacom's forces, saw the destruction of a settlement and the capture of several colonists, including Mary Rowlandson. Rowlandson's subsequent account of her captivity provided a detailed and vivid portrayal of Native American life and the harsh realities of the war from the perspective of the settlers. As the war progressed, the tide began to turn against the Native American forces. The English employed increasingly aggressive tactics, including the use of allied Native American tribes to fight against Metacom's coalition. Additionally, the harsh winter of 1676, combined with dwindling supplies and internal strife among the tribes, weakened the resistance. In August 1676, Metacom was killed, and his head was publicly displayed by the colonists as a grim trophy. Despite his death, the conflict continued until 1678, with the remaining Native American forces being eventually defeated. The aftermath of the war was devastating for the Native American tribes. Many survivors were sold into slavery, while others were forcibly relocated to reservations. The destruction of entire villages and the loss of their leaders left the tribes in disarray. The war significantly altered the balance of power in New England, leading to increased colonial control over Native American lands. King Philip's War was more than a mere conflict. It was a profound struggle for survival and cultural preservation. It highlighted the profound impact of European colonization on indigenous populations and set a precedent for future colonial Native relations. The war's legacy continued to influence American policies towards Native Americans, shaping the way the U.S. government approached indigenous issues in the years that followed. The story of King Philip's War is a poignant reminder of the resilience of Native American societies in the face of overwhelming adversity. Medicum's leadership and the sacrifice of countless Native American warriors underscore the profound struggle for autonomy and justice. Their fight against colonization and their enduring spirit continue to be a testament to their strength and resistance. In modern times, the war is remembered not only for its historical significance, but also for its impact on Native American identity and the broader narrative of American history. King Philip's War remains a powerful symbol of the complex and often painful interactions between Native Americans and European settlers, reflecting the deep and lasting consequences of colonization. The Plymouth colony was founded in November 1620 and lost half its population to disease and malnutrition by spring 1621. From the time of their arrival until March 1621, they had been observed by the tribes of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Europeans had been arriving in the region by that time for over 20 years, and in 1614, the English Captain Hunt had kidnapped a number of natives to sell into slavery. Hunt had not been the first to do so, nor the first to disrespect Native American lands and culture. The arrival of the Europeans had also brought disease, which had killed a significant number of natives who had no natural immunity to them. The Wampanoag Confederacy had been the most powerful political and military force before it was reduced to tributary status by the loss of people to disease. Massasoit's first impulse, therefore, was to call on the higher powers of the land to drive off or destroy the immigrants. But when it seemed his prayers would not be answered, he chose a different course. The Wampanoag Confederacy had been the most powerful political and military force in the land before it was reduced to tributary status by the loss of people to disease. The Wampanoags now paid tribute to the Narragansetts, whereas, earlier, the situation had been the reverse. Massasoit saw in the survival of the English a sign that he should ally with them and restore himself and his tribe to its former position of power. In March of 1621, he sent Samoset L., circa 1590 to 1653, an Abenaki prisoner who spoke English, to the colony to find out if they were interested in peaceful relations. Samoset returned a good report, and so Massasoit then sent Squanto, also known as Tisquantum L., circa 1585 to 1622, and finally arrived himself with his warriors. On March 22, 1621, Massasoit and John Carver signed the so-called Pilgrim Wampanoag Peace Treaty, pledging mutual aid and defense to one another, and Massasoit assigned Squanto the task of teaching the colonists how to survive. He later sent his trusted advisor Hobomok, D.C., 1643, to lend further assistance and supervise Squanto. In the early years of the settlement, the immigrants and natives took care of each other. Massasoit and his confederacy regained their former status, and the colony flourished. The second governor, William Bradford L., 1590 to 1657, continued to honor the treaty and expanded trade with the Wampanoag, while another leading colonist and third governor, Edward Winslow L., 1595 to 1655, saved the life of Massasoit as well as those of a number of his tribe who had fallen ill. The head of the colony's militia, Captain Miles Standish L., circa 1584 to 1656, became close friends with Hobomok just as Bradford did with Squanto. In the year 1630 CE, a pivotal moment in American history unfolded as John Winthrop, a prominent Puritan leader, and his contingent of 700 settlers arrived in New England. Their mission was to expand upon the nascent settlement of Massachusetts Bay, situated north of Plymouth, which had been established by the Pilgrims in 1620. This influx of settlers marked the beginning of a significant transformation in the region, fundamentally altering the landscape, culture, and demographic composition of New England. John Winthrop and his fellow Puritans arrived at a time when the region was in a state of transition. The lands they would settle were initially claimed by John Endicott in 1628 CE for England. Endicott, an early colonist and a staunch Puritan, had asserted English claims over the land, which he found unoccupied. This land had previously been inhabited by Native American tribes, but a series of devastating epidemics, brought about by earlier European contact, had ravaged the local populations, leaving the villages largely deserted. To Endicott, these seemingly abandoned lands appeared ripe for the taking. The arrival of Winthrop and his colonists marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the Great Migration, a period of intense Puritan migration from England to the New World between 1630 and 1640. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, driven by its religious zeal and a sense of divine mission, sought to establish a city upon a hill, a model Christian society that would serve as an example to the rest of the world. The influx of settlers brought a heightened demand for land, which in turn led to the expansion of settlements and agricultural activities. Simultaneously, the religious climate within Massachusetts Bay was marked by a strict adherence to Puritan orthodoxy. The colony's founders, including Winthrop, believed that their covenant with God was contingent upon their adherence to religious and moral laws. Deviations from these norms were seen as threats to the colony's success and divine favor. As a result, dissenters who challenged the established religious order were met with severe consequences. Roger Williams, a prominent dissenting voice, was exiled in 1636 for his criticism of the colony's religious practices and his belief in the separation of church and state. Williams went on to found Providence Colony in what is now modern-day Rhode Island, establishing a haven for religious freedom. And Hutchinson, another key figure, followed a similar path. Hutchinson, a religious dissenter who held unorthodox views about the Puritan ministry, was also expelled from Massachusetts Bay. She subsequently founded Portsmouth, further illustrating the fractious nature of religious life in the colonies. Other dissenters and seekers of new opportunities spread out, establishing settlements in Connecticut and New Hampshire. These new colonies were both a testament to the dynamic and often contentious nature of early American religious and political life. The encroachment of European settlers into Native American territories was driven by more than just religious motivations. It was also a reflection of differing worldviews regarding land ownership and use. Native American tribes had a fundamentally different understanding of land compared to the English colonists. For Native Americans, land was not a commodity to be owned, but a sacred trust from the divine. Their relationship with the land was one of stewardship rather than ownership. They saw the land as a living entity, to be cared for and used in harmony with the natural world. Tribal conflicts over land were often rooted in issues of honor, resource access, or retribution rather than a desire for conquest or ownership. When Native Americans engaged in transactions with the English settlers, they often did so with a different conceptual framework. What the English perceived as land sales were, in the Native American understanding, agreements akin to rental, arrangements, or temporary use rights. The idea of selling land outright, and thus relinquishing all rights and connections to it, was alien to their worldview. Consequently, even after such transactions, Native Americans continued to hunt, plant, and use the land as they always had, believing it still belonged to them in a spiritual and practical sense. This fundamental misalignment in understandings of land ownership and usage created significant tensions between the Native Americans and the European settlers. The colonists' increasing demands for land and resources clashed with the Native Americans' view of their enduring relationship with the land. As English settlements expanded and more land was appropriated, conflicts intensified. The English, driven by their religious fervor and colonial ambitions, often failed to appreciate or respect the Native Americans' perspectives and rights. The impact of these misunderstandings and conflicts was profound and far-reaching. Native American tribes found themselves increasingly displaced and marginalized as European settlements spread. The traditional ways of life for many tribes were disrupted, and their social, economic, and spiritual connections to their lands were eroded. The resulting tensions and conflicts set the stage for future confrontations, including King Philip's War, which would become a dramatic and tragic chapter in the history of colonial Native American relations. In summary, the period from 1630 to 1640 in New England was marked by significant demographic and cultural shifts. The arrival of Puritan settlers, driven by religious motivations and an expansionist mindset, led to the displacement of Native American tribes and the erosion of their traditional ways of life. The differing worldviews regarding land ownership and use created a foundation for conflict, illustrating the complexities and challenges of early American colonialism. The legacy of these interactions continues to resonate in the ongoing discussions about land rights, cultural preservation, and historical understanding. As the English settlers were establishing their foothold in Massachusetts and Connecticut, another colonial power, the Dutch, had already begun to make their presence felt in the region known as New Netherlands, which corresponds to modern-day New York State. The Dutch, under the aegis of the Dutch West India Company, were actively engaged in expanding their trading network and asserting control over key trade routes and territories. Their expansionism brought them into direct competition with the English, who were similarly motivated by ambitions of growth and resource acquisition. The burgeoning Dutch influence in New Netherlands had significant repercussions for the English colonists. By the early 1630s, the Dutch had become active in trading and negotiating with Native American tribes, particularly those in Connecticut, such as the Pequot tribe. The Pequot, who occupied a region along Long Island Sound and the interior of Connecticut, were pivotal players in the regional trade networks. Their position as a central trading hub made them a critical partner for both the Dutch and the English. The competition for dominance in this lucrative trade arena quickly escalated in a conflict. Tensions between English and Dutch traders, each supported by their respective Native American allies, began to surface as early as 1633. These tensions were exacerbated in 1634 and 1636 when two English traders were killed by members of the Western Nyanek tribe, who were allied with the Pequots. The deaths of these traders were seized upon by the English as a pretext to escalate their military actions against the Pequots. The resulting conflict, known as the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, was a decisive and brutal chapter in early American colonial history. The English, determined to secure their position and expand their territorial claims, waged a relentless campaign against the Pequot tribe. The Pequots, who had initially sought to defend their lands and influence, found themselves in a precarious position. They had attempted to forge alliances with other powerful tribes, including the Narragansetts, to strengthen their resistance against the English encroachment. The Pequots advocated for a guerrilla-style warfare strategy, characterized by swift, surprise attacks designed to harass and weaken their opponents while avoiding direct, protracted battles. However, their efforts to rally the Narragansetts as allies were thwarted. Roger Williams, a prominent figure in colonial New England, had lived among the Narragansetts and spoke their language. Williams, who was sympathetic to the plight of the Native Americans but also understood the strategic realities of the colonial struggle, advised the Narragansetts to align with the English rather than the Pequots. The Narragansetts, weighing their options and considering the growing power of the English settlers, ultimately chose to side with the English. This decision proved disastrous for the Pequots, as it not only deprived them of a crucial ally, but also reinforced the English's position. The Pequot War reached its climax with the Treaty of Hartford, signed in September 1638. This treaty marked the formal end of the conflict and had significant repercussions for the Pequot tribe. The treaty resulted in the near-total annihilation of the Pequot people. Many Pequot were killed in battle or captured and sold into slavery. The survivors were forced to disband and scatter, with some joining other tribes while others were enslaved or pushed into servitude. Under the terms of the Treaty of Hartford, the Pequot lands were divided between the English and their Native American allies. The English claimed the most fertile and strategically advantageous territories, including lands along major rivers. This redistribution of land further solidified the English presence in Connecticut and laid the groundwork for future expansion. Simultaneously, the influx of new immigrants from England continued to swell the ranks of the colonial population. As more settlers arrived, the pressure on Native American lands intensified. The English settlers continued to encroach upon and appropriate additional lands, particularly those of the Wampanoag Confederacy and other tribes in the region. This relentless expansion contributed to growing tensions and conflicts between the settlers and the Native American tribes. The Pequot War was a harrowing and transformative event that reshaped the landscape of colonial New England. It demonstrated the violent and often devastating consequences of colonial expansion and competition for resources. The near extermination of the Pequot tribe and the subsequent appropriation of their lands were emblematic of the broader patterns of displacement and dispossession experienced by many Native American tribes in the wake of European colonization. The Pequot War, wholly contrived by the English for land, resulted in the dispersion of the Pequots, with many of them enslaved and given to Mohegan and Narragansett allies, and others sold locally or to slavers. After King Philip's War, also instigated by the English through broken treaties and promises, this same policy was followed. In both cases, colonists were reacting to the fear of a widespread Native American uprising, such as the Jamestown colony settlements had experienced in March of 1622, when the Powhatan chief Opkanakano, L. 1554 to 1646, had killed 347 colonists in a single morning in what became known as the Indian Massacre of 1622. These fears were not groundless, either, as this is precisely the course suggested by the Pequots to the Narragansetts and later, the plan Metacom envisioned for his own resistance to the English invasion. Plymouth Colony, which would never have survived without Wampanoag assistance, sold over 1,000 Wampanoags and their allies into slavery in Bermuda and the West Indies and expanded their reach into former Wampanoag territory. Massachusetts Bay and the others also expanded as the surviving natives were pushed onto reservations or were absorbed by other tribes and left the region. Later alliances between natives with the English and French were influenced by relationships established during much came to a close after Metacom's assassination, but continued in the north between colonists and natives of the Wabanaki tribe and their allies until 1678, when the Treaty of Casco was signed. By that time, the conflict had claimed thousands of lives on both sides, saw over half of the English settlements damaged or destroyed and native villages ruined. Crop supplies had been burned, and numerous injuries would hamper survivors from being of King Philip's War, which also informed later U.S. policy, tow the war in Massachusetts pretty little to work the land as they had before. Our Native Americans. The war was not won by the English because of superior weapons or tactics. The colonial militias were poorly commanded, barely organized, groups of men armed with muskets, which were far less effective than the bow and arrows of the natives. The war was won because of the lack of unity among Native American tribes, the seemingly inexhaustible supply of immigrants, and, finally, through lies. The English made promises to the natives they had no intention of keeping, and just as with the understanding of land rights, this concept of making deals without any intention of honoring them was foreign to Native American culture and, ultimately, was the immigrants' most powerful weapon.